I would say that in terms of your interview and activism and all, I think having a sense of humor and being able to, go with where popular culture goes with things is part of how we sort of uh, help people think about this, and just have fun. It it's a dire time
Yeah.
figuring out how to have fun despite all the setbacks we've had.
Yeah.
You, we're doing this not because we think we'll win. We do it because it matters, and that's the most important thing. It matters. We continue to do it. We have to believe that those efforts alone matter. I mean, the whole crisis of fire, I'll just jump ahead for you to know, is the question of should a national group influence how a local group is organized?
Yeah.
Is can the Boston Fire do this? Can the Boston Fire have this policy versus, say, a Portland Fire or whatever? And I was not involved in that process directly, except as people were talking to me. But I think that was definitely what is the structure for moving forward when you've moved from being one kind of thing to another?
And the larger structure of the movement at that time was all of the grassroots groups were going professional, basically.
Well,
And
also grassroots groups were disappearing. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about for your question, maybe, I don't know whether it was the biggest, yeah, I guess two, the biggest barriers. I mean, we have to look back at grassroots activism of the 80s and the 90s, and that, well, several things, and we see that now too. Peter would come into a community and maybe do a naked campaign. And then when the local grassroots group wanted to do something and they contacted the media would say, well, is anybody going to be naked? We'll come out if someone's naked. So there was this ripple effect on suppressing grassroots um, viability. Then, yes, the gobbling up of grassroots groups. Also, grassroots groups were often headed by women. And even, I would meet women who would tell me, say, in Minnesota in the 90s, that they were the president, but when the media came to talk to them about some action, they'd turn to the man who was the vice president and ask
like the
him.
1800s,
Sorry?
like it's the 1800s.
I know. And this happened over and over again. And Jim Mason, who, is a really wonderful, sympathetic, thoughtful person. And he was traveling around in the 90s, and the women, he told me women would say to him, we're so glad you're here. Now the media will come out. So, and, you know, I think the whole question of what is successful in a movement, we have to first phrase, well, what's the movement? I mean, the animal rights movement was so patriarchal right from the beginning. The fact that it's inspired by, as the story is told, I mean, by Peter Singer's animal liberation, which I felt, really in some ways set us back because his whole introduction is teleological. First there was Black liberation, and then gay liberation and women's liberation, and now there's animal liberation. And so there had been a teleological fulfillment rather than placing it within. Now, I think that hurt. I mean, hurt us. I also think that in the early 1970s, there were, vegan, where we didn't think of ourselves as vegan. When I tried to go vegan in 76, I didn't think of it as going vegan. I thought of it as becoming a complete vegetarian. So you're going to have language issues too, Corey. You know, when you're looking back historically, Rin Barry was doing a history of veganism when he died. Do you know him about his work?
Yeah, he did some historical work, and also I think he wrote the book on Hitler being vegetarian.
Right. And he also did
Yeah,
interviews with vegetarians. But I don't know what happened to his notes. He died without a will. That's why we did that's one of the prompts for Even Vegans Die was we
really?
had a couple vegans dying without wills. You know, his longtime girlfriend couldn't get access to his books or his work, but he was doing a history of veganism. And you know, historically, how do we find it in the 19th century? Because you've got a word that's coined, you know, in 40 or 41. And, you know, the same problem with vegetarian, you know, as I say in Sexual Politics of Meat, you've got Pythagorean. Well, was Pythagorean possibly vegan in some ways? Um, I don't know. But so when you look at the early 70s, um, you've got, you know, feminists embracing vegetarianism as it was called then for a variety of reasons. You know, the anti-war. This one friend, you know, had stopped in to get blood from a slaughterhouse for an anti-war protest, Vietnam War protest, and she walked away and she thought, well, what am I doing? You know, the blood of an animal to represent blood, and became a vegetarian. Um, Economic vegetarians, Lisa Leghorn, who went on to do some amazing work, who really I think became vegan on the economic, the Frances Moore LePay approach of the loss of all that food stuff into animals. So I sort of mourn what got lost because animal liberation took over the conversation, just as I think feminists were working on and exploring a variety of ways of talking about this. And so I'm sort of sad about that.
Yeah. Well, that's
And
the
I hope
aim to this book, is to try and restore a little bit of our perspectives on this larger discourse.
there was a wonderful magazine, The Beast. Have you seen it? Have you seen old copies of it?
No.
It and I was in England and saw it, so I subscribed to it so I'd get it in the US. That's where I first saw Ursula Hamdress because Jim had taken a photo of it, of the the picture, because it was hanging at the Iowa State Fair.
Hmm.
And play and the Beast carried it. It was a radical animal journal of the early 80s.
No, I've not heard of this at all.
And I've got it. Where is it? I mean, I'm sure, well, the British Library has to have it, right? But um, so I don't know if it was via that. I started corresponding with someone who was working around, maybe it was vegetarianism and feminism and lesbianism in England. And she was discouraged. They were trying to raise the issue of vivisection at a feminist conference like in 78 or 79 and weren't successful. That's when I was an activist in upstate New York, and I did not I wasn't a very good correspondent. So, for instance, this is an interesting story. Off Our Backs, which, you know, in the 70s, it was the feminist newspaper. I mean, there were other Sojourners in Boston and New Women's Times. Is that the one in New York? And Old Wives' Tale, San Francisco. Um, but I put a little thing in Chicken Lady, which was sort of a page of Off Our Backs that, you know, had a variety of things, and it said, you know, Carol Adams is working on feminism and vegetarianism and is, you know, looking to hear from others. Josie wrote me in 1980, but it's when I was involved in we were fighting a city for racism and housing, and um we had started a hotline for battered women, and it was in our house. And I did not answer that letter till 1988, 8 years.
Mm.
And then I wrote Josie and I said, we had moved here to Texas at that point, and I wasn't doing that day-to-day activism. I said, can someone possibly answer a letter 8 years later? And the answer is yes, you can. So I just could not keep all the connections going at that time. I mean, I was working on the book off and on, but I couldn't keep up with everything happening out in the world and what was happening in my rural area.
It's interesting you're in Texas. What brought you to Texas?
So when we were in upstate, so we're in Western New York, west of Buffalo, which is where I grew up.
Mm.
And I never thought I'd go back there, but I had gone back after Yale Divinity School. And my mother had been involved with this group called the Chautauqua County Rural Ministry. It's in upstate New York in the 50s. There were a lot of migrant workers, and every county had a migrant committee that was supported by the New York State Council of Churches. And then in the 60s, migrant workers started resettling there, and they needed support throughout the year. These committees would provide support when the migrant workers were there, which is usually from like April till October. Many of them were flown up from Puerto Rico. Each farmer would have his own little village that he would work with, where he'd fly the men up, and then of course provide housing that was just terrible. And my mother was involved in the 60s. And I came home and I had applied for a Rotary Fellowship to study in Australia and had just received it, but also the director of the rural ministry had just left. So I said, well, I'll do the job during the summer until I go to Australia. And during that time, because Australia is in the Southern Hemisphere, I wasn't going till January instead of September. I fell in love.
Mm.
And but that wasn't going to be enough to get me to give up a fellowship, because what feminist would give up a fellowship? But I flew to San Francisco on my way to Australia and stayed with friends. And one of the people I stayed with was Chellis Glendening. Chellis, I do not believe is a vegan. I don't know. I haven't been in touch with her for years, but she's was the first person to write me a letter after reading my piece in the Lesbian Reader from 1975 that argued for a connection between feminism and vegetarianism. And she went on to become an eco psychologist.
Mm.
But I had a dream at her place. Do you want to know this?
Yeah,
This is
sure.
it's
Yeah.
sort of so it's January of 1978. I'm on my way to Australia, and I have this dream in which I'm in a fast food restaurant. And since I ate cheese at that time, I go into a McDonald's or some fast food place, and I order a cheeseburger without the burger. And the person keeps handing me a cheeseburger, and I say, I don't want a cheeseburger. I want a cheeseburger without the burger. And finally, I woke up crying.
Mm.
I'd never awakened crying in my life from a dream. I was so frustrated, and so Chella said to me, well, what are you giving yourself that you don't want? And I thought about it, and I thought, it's this trip to Australia.
Whoa.
I I've gotten involved in some really interesting work in Western New York. And I've met someone I've fallen in love with, and my work is there and my love is there. Why am I going to Australia? And I gave up the fellowship.
Wow.
And when I took my airline ticket in, this is to San Francisco, it said, Hawaii, Fiji, Sydney, and then I was coming back through Vietnam and all. And the woman looked at me when I handed it in for a one-way ticket to Buffalo in January. And she said, do you know what you're doing? You know, I've never seen anything like this. So anyway, I went back, and the thing that was obvious was that there was a housing crisis for low income people and a housing crisis in terms of racism. So for the next few years, we worked together and we sued the city. And uh, my spouse, a Presbyterian minister, was the president of my board, and they kept it that way even after we married. So he was often the vocal person speaking on what we believed in. And that resulted in him being appointed to the housing authority that was going to build the housing we prevailed about. And that brought him to the attention of a very high powered Dallas church that was looking for a minister with expertise in housing.
Oh,
And they called all around the country, to every presbytery, which is the governing agency. And when they called the Presbytery of Western New York and said, "Do you have a minister who's got some background in housing?" The person said, "My God, do we?" So um, I never thought I would go south of the Mason-Dixon line. This was a shock to us. But our arrangement had been that we would go where he was best, suited or called, in the words of a Presbyterian, minister. And I would get to finish my book and raise our child, who was then 2.5. So that arrangement brought us here in 87. And then in the next 2 years, I finished the book, wrote Josie, finally had the time to start catching up with everything I've been thinking. Martin Rowe, do you know Martin? He he was at Lantern Books, but he and I were talking. Uh, do you know the 6-part audio thing about 200 years after Martin's Law?
yes.
And they decided to do the 5th uh, one focusing on women, so that Peter comes in, Peter or Tom, they come in, but they focused on the women of the 60s and the early 70s. And Martin and I were talking the other day, and he said, you really should just, maybe a group of you should do a book called The History of Animal Liberation and never mention a man in it. Just, you know, do the whole history and never mention a man. And
Which there's an amazing book that just came out a couple of years ago on all the women's contributions to that were kind of overlooked.
what you don't mean the Oxford Circle, the one that it's awful.
But it does explicitly say that women were involved with it and not always given credit. What do you think?
He basically says that the whole thing, I think, from my point of view, is situated to explain how Peter Singer became the #1 philosopher.
Hmm.
And even his chapter on Peter, what is it called? That second or third chapter, it's supportive relationships or something. The whole thing is created, and they haven't talked to Roz Godlovich or Stan.
Hmm.
There was a deliberate effort in the early 70s to masculinize the movement. This anxiety of femaleness, being identified, to save the movement from the women. I remember when it came out, I was already working on, what becomes Sexual Politics of Meat. I'd written my first essay um, in I had the idea in late September, October 74. I write the essay for Mary Daly in the spring of 75. And it's right when Animal Liberation comes out. And I remember reading it and thinking, this doesn't help me at all.
Hmm.
You know, th there's nothing here that helps me think the way I want to think.
Yeah. And it kind of also Ruth Harrison's work was similar in a lot of ways, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, in terms of getting lost.
Well, getting lost, but also covering a lot the rise of the factory farm system, as a lot of
Right.
immigration does. I find difficulty. Well, now I steer clear of it, but in the past felt like it was my obligation as a teacher to assign Peter Singer, and I would find it difficult to do so because it just didn't gel with, as a sociologist, what we were trying to achieve, which is to think intersectionally and think critically. It was just
No, and the fact is, he, how many people became utilitarians because of that? It's his graphic writing that I think was, and a sort of uh, cheap version of utilitarianism that people took away. But most people did not become utilitarians. I think this is why he did effective altruism in the 21st century. That didn't work to get people utilitarian. So now, he's going to try something else. Um, but I think he's very, very out of touch with social change movements.
well,
And
just looking at the things he's published on disabled people with
oh
disabilities.
my God, but see, that's utilitarianism. Everything lives and dies by the utilitarian philosophy. And once you've accepted that, well, then there's animals, and then there's the disabled, and then there's effective altruism. The center for him is utilitarianism. I mean, it just shows the problems with utilitarian thought too, of course, which we tried to deal with in the anthology on the good promises. I mean, talk about activism and all. You've got examples there. I mean, vegan activism, feminist vegan activism, and anti-racist vegan activism um,
Can't be
represent there.
quantified, so it doesn't count.
So, um, yeah, I mean, I think rewriting the 70s is very important. That's one of the things you're just going to have to talk about. Like when I worked on writing the first version of the book that I withdrew, I interviewed like 40 to 50 women in Boston, and I still have the tapes somewhere. I've got to find them
Yeah,
about why they were vegetarian. And the book was going to have a chapter of recipes, and all the recipes were vegan. I didn't call them vegan, but complete vegetarian. There was no dairy, no eggs in the chapter that was the recipes. So, but it's this language, how, for instance, some people would say, well, I'm an ovo vegetarian, or I'm a lacto vegetarian, or ovo lacto. So,
those terms.
by definition, if you weren't those,
Right.
was the vegetarian a vegan? Or did the vegetarian then have to say, I'm a complete vegetarian? What's the unmodified vegetarian? Do you know,
Right.
McKinnon, Feminism Unmodified? Why does feminism have to have, some label, Marxist, liberal, even vegan? Can feminism be unmodified? Well, what's the is vegetarian unmodified vegan? And, who knows? Probably for some people it was. And, I finally changed the book to feminist vegan critical theory. Well, it had always been a critical theory that was vegan, but could I go back in time and say, these people were vegans, not vegetarians? I mean, it threw me off about what the subtitle could be. And then somebody pushed me and said, well, it's still a vegan theory. Why don't you just
Right.
claim it? So I did
But you had
finally.
published a very long time ago, like 15 plus years ago, you published an article. So I think the title was Why Feminist Vegan Now.
Mm.
So you've been using that term for a while. So that was interesting to me, is like what actually sparked to finally, anyone who's read the book knows that it's about veganism, but what finally sparked you to do that switch in the title?
Yeah, it was this email. Uh, somebody, let me just see what he said. This graduate student.
Hmm.
Uh, I have. I hope this email finds you well. This is 2023. I teach philosophy in college, and I'm currently working on a paper on your book. The Sexual Politics of Meat, to introduce it to other French-speaking college professors. However, I happen to struggle with one thing in the book, and I hope that you could spare a few minutes to help me out. Here's my question. Why is The Sexual Politics of Meat not subtitled a feminist vegan critical theory instead of feminist vegetarian? And then he goes into, why it should be. Is the reason for the use of vegetarianism then because you felt the term vegan wasn't known early in the early 90s? Or is it because you think that vegetarianism is in its true essence the same as veganism, but that it's lost its original meaning? Uh, he's just wondering. Anyway, I thought about it and I thought, you know, he's right. I should. Other people had said it, but he just maybe it was good timing, and we had just started talking about the 35th anniversary, and I thought times have changed. Vegetarian carries a conservative meaning now. It didn't carry that meaning in 1990.
Right.
I tried to do a book with vegan in its title in the year 2000, and the publisher was a vegan, and he said people don't know that word well enough to use vegan in the title, and that's 2000.
Yeah.
So, but by 2020 it's clear, vegetarians, why are you eating dairy? And if people thought that I wasn't dealing with that issue, that my book was condemned to a conservative viewpoint that it didn't have. So I needed to have the book catch up with the meaning, I guess.
It'd be fair to say also that the animal rights movement itself was a bit afraid of the word vegan until only recently.
I think that's more complex than that. I mean, like lots of animal rights people in the 90s were vegan and activists, and the vegan meals. I think what you've got the animal rights movement going along, but then you've got the vegan movement going along. They're two, it's, I don't know what it's like fish swimming in water or something. They're interacting, they're going between, but they're very different. And you've got vegan men very anxious not to be seen as vegan like women. And then like Rip Esselstyn and others who, for a little while they tried the term hegan.
Oh yeah. Good riddance.
So talk about the misogyny of that.
Yeah.
You can't be vegan because vegan is too associated with women. So then you've got plant-based, plant-powered, all of that as movements away from claiming vegan because vegan carried, gendered associations. So, all of these issues, which I'm sorry we won't get covered. About the misogyny in the movements. How do we measure success? What's historically, what were the biggest barriers to activism? Misogyny, which already had labeled vegetarianism and then veganism, and doesn't trust the women or doesn't listen to the women or sexually exploits the women. You've got misogyny throughout. I mean, did I see myself as an animal rights activist in the 80s? I don't know.
Hmm.
I raised the issue. I talked about it. I was trying to write about it. But the animal rights movement has always struck me as problematic. And the minute Sexual Politics of Meat appeared, I start hearing from people within days. Uh, and, it's not just sending me images that prove my point, but I started hearing from women who were being sexually exploited in the movement. So you ask, like, what's a success in the movement? Well, how many women left the movement because of sexual exploitation? Or got forced out because they knew too much about Wayne Pacelli and they had to sign NDAs? Or, there is a really wonderful person, an activist, and she broke up with one of the leading men who was at HSUS, and all the men turned on her, and she became a cookbook writer. She was a great activist. I mean, to even measure activism in the animal rights movement and success. It's just, I don't know how we do that, because what I see are the costs and consequences to women. And, you know, way back when the first edition of Sexual Politics of Meat came out, I wrote to Andrea Dworkin to thank her for providing, one of the first blurbs. And she wrote me a great postcard. I could probably find it.
You might.
Um, and said, I am worried about the women who join the animal rights movement instead of the feminist movement. And when you look at theories about women's activism, and I think there's something McKinnon says too, that being involved in a movement on behalf of yourself can be threatening. And so now we have 75% or 65% or whatever of the animal rights movement women. It's not just what are they accomplishing, but what are they not raising? What are they not dealing with? That's what sort of Andrea Dworkin raised. So you had a question, a difficult question you were going to ask me before the break. I think was it anti-racism?
Well, that was, yeah, that, and I did kind of bring that up, is how you came into doing what you do. With that history started, well, I don't know if you started out with it per se, but this foundation of anti-racism work. And then how did you start focusing on the animal issue, basically?
Yeah, so once I had the idea in 74 and then, started working on a book, and then I gave up the grant, and I'm doing this day-to-day stuff around domestic violence and rape and migrant workers and racism. And during the day I'm fighting these fights and being an advocate and working with other people, but I'm still reading everything I possibly can. Man in the Natural World, Keith Thomas's, when that came out, I'm reading that at the same time as I'm reading McKinnon, or so my mind is constantly bringing these things together. But what that did, the work against racism did, was it made sure that I never was going to rely on the writings of white theorists or white novelists, or that in my work I was not going to allow that sort of ignorance that I understood, not as well as I do now, white supremacy. I mean, in the 80s I called it racism, but I was not going to be one of those white women writing uh, without being in touch with, what I had lived, which was the reality of race in the 80s. They're frightening. It's just frightening to me to see these racist attitudes, but wanting to figure it out. And then reading everybody I could about the civil rights movement and abolition and Black women writers. So that injustice, that and abortion rights are two injustices that just, are deep within me, that I will always feel impassioned about. So the question about vegan feminist, what's my vegan feminist vision? Um, Hands off the bodies of others. Hands off pregnant, making animals pregnant, forcing women to be pregnant, compulsory pregnancy, eliminate compulsory pregnancy, then we'd have no animal agriculture, because there's no pregnant animals producing the victims of non-vegans. And hands off, if we really had a policy of hands off pregnant women, we would have to have achieved equality, and misogyny would be something that people were afraid to articulate, rather than something that's part of a presidential campaign. So I think the other part of the feminist vegan vision is that it's beautiful. It's delicious. People are afraid of veganism. My God, I could eat a different meal every day for the rest of my life and still not have explored all the wonderful options. I think a feminist vegan vision is connected to where we are in the world, and ecofeminist, it's contextual and respectful, but uh, not quiescent or silent. And as a writer, I believe that theory matters and that theory inspires, and activism and theory can change lives. I know that. I still hear from people whose lives were changed by sexual politics of meat. So I would also grab theory and make sure that it's seen as an activist um, plan, an activist part of an activist toolbox. It truly became a thing. So anyway, it's because my son, when he was 3.5, went into a Halloween, a magic store with my spouse, and the son, 3.5, said, "Did you know that Frankenstein's monster was a vegetarian?" This is in 1988, when I was working on the book. And the man leans down and says, "Well, what, son? What did you say?" "Well, Frankenstein's monster was a vegetarian." Just, imagine all those syllables in the mouth of a 3.5-year-old. And after that, my spouse just started finding interesting Frankenstein things that became part of our life. I've got Frankenstein nutcrackers and salt shakers. And if you see something blue, the blue ones in the back, they're from England. They're the only times I've seen the monster in blue. The puppet is from that toy store in Covent Garden, and the blue mask is way up north of Scotland. I mean, northern Scotland, really high. Some department store when we came onto the mainland from Orkney, and I found that. So anyway, I have so much. This is just the top of the line, sort of.